Good morning, everyone. Today, the panel in the Grenfell Tower Inquiry is publishing its final report dealing with the root causes of the fire. In phase one of the investigations, I examined the events of the 14th of June 2017, how the fire started, how it escaped from the flat where it had begun, and how it spread over the whole building with tragic consequences. My report on that series of events was published on the 30th of October 2019. In the second phase of the inquiry, the panel has been investigating the underlying causes of the fire with a view to identifying where mistakes were made and ensuring that a similar disaster cannot occur again. This second part of the investigations has taken longer than we had hoped, partly because of the broad scope of our terms of reference, and partly because, as our investigations progressed, we uncovered many more matters of concern than we had originally expected. As we discovered, it is not possible properly to understand the causes of the fire without understanding the way in which knowledge of the materials and methods of construction employed in the refurbishment developed over the course of time, what the government and others learnt about them, and how the regulations and guidance relating to their use developed during the same period. The information obtained in that part of our investigations provided the background to our examination of the refurbishment itself and the various decisions taken in the course of it, particularly in relation to the selection of materials. In addition, it has been necessary for us to examine the way in which fire safety at Grenfell Tower was managed, including the arrangements for fire risk assessments and the response to them, as well as the relationship between the tenant management organisation and the residents of the tower. The firefighting operations of the London Fire Brigade were considered in detail in my first report, but a number of questions relating to organisation and training could not be answered at that stage and were deferred for consideration in phase two. Also deferred to phase two were certain questions relating to the development of the fire, including the relative contributions of the different materials used in the cladding. Another important aspect of our terms of reference was to investigate the response of the authorities to the emergency. Finally, but most importantly, it was necessary for us to investigate in as much detail as the evidence would allow the circumstances surrounding the deaths of those who perished in the fire. The report we're publishing today contains our findings on all these and other matters. However, the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. They include the government, the tenant management organisation, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, those who manufactured and supplied the materials used in the refurbishment, those who certified their suitability for use on high-rise buildings, the architect, the principal contractor, and some of its subcontractors, in particularly Harley Curtain Wall and its successor Harley Facades, some of the consultants, in particular the fire engineer Exover Warrington Fire, the local authority's building control department, and the London Fire Brigade. Not all of them bear the same degree of responsibility for the eventual disaster, but as our reports show, all contributed to it in one way or another, in most cases through incompetence, but in some cases through dishonesty and greed. The failings can be traced back over many years, and our efforts to get to the bottom of what went wrong and why account for the length of our report and the time it has taken us to produce it. However, if an inquiry of this kind is to produce anything of value, it is necessary for those who can influence the future direction of the construction industry, the fire and rescue services, the management of fire safety in buildings, and resilience planning to understand exactly where mistakes were made and how they can be avoided in the future. The report is divided into 14 parts, broadly by reference to related subjects. Some parts contain several chapters, some only one. As with the Phase 1 report, it begins with an introduction followed by an executive summary. Although the executive summary runs to 24 pages, the length of the report means that it can touch on only the most significant elements of our conclusions. However, it should assist readers in finding their way around the report. Part 2 describes significant events that provided the background to the fire. It begins by explaining how the regulations and guidance in force at the time of the refurbishment came into being, and the way in which the reaction to fire of materials used in the construction of modern high-rise buildings was tested. We then consider the involvement of the government in the form of the then Department for Communities and Local Government, the way in which it sought to monitor the causes of fires when they occurred, and most importantly, the warning signs that were emerging from as early as 1991 that some kinds of materials, in particular aluminium composite material panels with unmodified polyethylene cores, were dangerous. We find that there was a failure on the part of the government and others to give proper consideration at an early stage to the dangers of using combustible materials in the walls of high-rise buildings. That including failing to amend in an appropriate way the statutory guidance on the construction of external walls. That is where the seeds of the disaster were sown. In Part 3, we set out our findings about the testing and marketing of the main products used in the refurbishment: the Rainabond panels, the Celotex RS5000 insulation, and the small amount of Kingspan K15 insulation. We discovered that there had been systematic dishonesty on the part of manufacturers involving deliberate manipulation of the testing processes and calculated attempts to mislead purchasers into thinking that what were combustible materials complied with the provisions of the statutory guidance that advised against their use. That dishonest approach to marketing was compounded by the failure of two of the bodies that provided certificates of compliance with the building regulations and statutory guidance: the British Board of Agreement and Local Authority Building Control, to scrutinise the information provided to them with sufficient care and exercise the degree of rigour and independence that was to be expected of them. The tenant management organisation was at the heart of events leading up to the fire. In Part 4 of the report, we make our findings about its relationship with the residents of Grenfell Tower. We find that the organisation was badly run and failed to respond to criticisms of its treatment of residents contained in independent reports produced in 2009. It is clear that for some years before the fire, relations between the TMO and residents were marked by distrust, antagonism, and increasingly bitter confrontation. We find that for the TMO to have allowed the relationship to deteriorate to such an extent reflects a serious failure on its part to observe its basic responsibilities. Part 5 of the report is concerned with the management of fire safety at the tower. Again, we find that the residents were badly let down. The picture is one of a persistent failure to give sufficient importance to the demands of fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people, and a failure on the part of the Council to scrutinise that aspect of the organisation's activities adequately. Part of the reason for that was the failure of the Chief Executive, Robert Black, to ensure that the board of the TMO and the Council were kept properly informed of matters affecting fire safety. That was despite periodic expressions of concern by the London Fire Brigade about compliance with the fire safety order, all of which should have been drawn to their attention. The TMO's failure to attach sufficient importance to fire safety is illustrated by its reliance on a single person, Carl Stokes, as fire risk assessor for its entire estate, despite his lack of qualifications and experience, by its failure to carry out necessary remedial work identified in fire risk assessments promptly, by its failure to provide measures to mitigate the absence of an effective smoke ventilation system, and by its failure to introduce appropriate arrangements for inspecting and maintaining fire prevention systems, in particular self-closing devices on the entrance doors to individual flats. In addition, the TMO failed to maintain a reasonably accurate record of those residents of the tower who were vulnerable for one reason or another and likely to need help to escape if a fire occurred. Part 6 of the report contains our findings about the refurbishment itself, and again the picture is disturbing. First, the regulatory context in which the work was carried out was, in our view, unsatisfactory because the statutory guidance, which was treated by many in the construction industry, including those engaged on the refurbishment, as containing a sufficient statement of what was required, did not make it clear enough that it was subject to the overriding requirements of the building regulations. That was a particular problem in relation to the rain screen panels, which, although they satisfied the requirement in the guidance for a material with a Class 0 surface, contained a highly combustible core. But that is only the beginning. The tenant management organisation, as the client, manipulated the process of appointing an architect to design the refurbishment in order to avoid the need to invite open tenders for the architectural services. It did so because it wanted to appoint Studio E, the architect for the existing Academy and Leisure Centre project, despite the fact that it had no experience of overcladding a high-rise building. That turned out to have significant consequences because Studio E failed to recognise, as a reasonably competent architect should have done, that the insulation and rain screen chosen for the refurbishment were combustible and unsuitable for that purpose. ACM panels were chosen as the rain screen to keep down the cost. Neither Ryden, the principal contractor, nor Harley, its cladding subcontractor, was aware of the properties of the materials specified for use in the refurbishment, although Harley, as a specialist subcontractor dealing with cladding, should have been, and Ryden, as principal contractor, had its own responsibility to ensure the materials were suitable. One of the problems that afflicted the refurbishment was a failure on the part of all concerned to understand where responsibility for any particular decision lay. That was especially the case in relation to the choice of the rain screen. The generally prevailing view was that since aluminium composite material panels had been used on other buildings without apparent problems, they were suitable for use on the tower. But no one was prepared to accept responsibility for having chosen them, and when questioned, everyone who was asked said that someone else had been responsible for ensuring that they were suitable. we find that Studio E, Ryden and Harley all took an unacceptably casual approach to contractual relations. None of their employees engaged on the project understood the relevant provisions of the building regulations, the statutory guidance, or such guidance from industry sources as was then available. That might not have mattered quite so much if proper advice had been taken from a competent and experienced fire engineer, or if building control had performed its task properly. In fact, the tenant management organisation did instruct Exover Warrington Fire to produce a fire safety strategy for the refurbishment, which should have included advice on the effect of the overcladding and the compliance of the external walls with the functional requirements of the building regulations. Exover produced 3 versions of a fire safety strategy, but each version was stated to be a draft and was incomplete because it did not deal with that particular question, which it said would be covered in a future issue of the report. It was clear, therefore, that the fire safety strategy was incomplete, but no one asked Exover to finish its work, nor did anyone provide it with details of the proposed cladding to enable it to do so. Exover itself failed to ask for the missing information or to complete the work it had been instructed to carry out. The failure to obtain a final report was probably critical, because if Exover had considered the proposed cladding, it should, and probably would, have identified the fact that the insulation and the rain screen did not comply with the statutory guidance or, more importantly, the building regulations. In Part 8, we set out our findings on the management and training of the London Fire Brigade in the years leading up to the fire. That part of our investigations represented a continuation of the work started in Phase 1, in which I described the response of the LFB on the night. I was critical of certain aspects of that response, in particular the way in which the control room handled calls from people trapped in the building, and the actions of some of the incident commanders who had not been properly trained to deal with a fire of that nature. That made it necessary for us to examine the London Fire Brigade's management and training in the period leading up to the fire, as well as the way in which it made use of the information available to it. In our report, we find that there were deficiencies in the organisation and management of the control room, the training of control room officers, and in the commissioning and delivery of training to operational crews, in particular in relation to incident command. There were also deficiencies in the collection of information needed to enable crews to prepare effectively to respond to fires in individual buildings. The primary cause of those problems was a chronic lack of effective leadership, combined with an undue emphasis on process and an attitude of complacency. We have also returned to investigate some aspects of the firefighting operations on the night of the fire, on which I was unable to make findings in Phase 1, in particular problems with communications and the supply of water. I shall return to Part 9 of the report in a moment, but for now I move to Part 10, in which we examine the authorities' response to the fire. Once again, we have found that those who lost their homes as a result of the fire were badly let down by the organisations that should have provided the support they desperately needed. The primary responsibility for that lay with the Council, which, as a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act, should have had plans in place to enable it to respond effectively to the emergency. In the event, however, it had failed to put in place suitable plans or to provide the training to its staff that was required to enable it to respond effectively to the situation it faced. In addition, its chief executive was ill-suited to taking control of what was undoubtedly a very serious challenge. The Council did not have the capacity to identify those who needed accommodation and other important forms of assistance, nor did it have arrangements in place for communicating with those affected by the disaster or the wider public. As a result, it was not capable of meeting the immediate needs of those who had been displaced and from their homes for food and shelter. In the end, it was local, voluntary and community organisations that filled the gap by providing rest centres and temporary shelter. The London-wide resilience structures that were intended to enable the capital to respond to an emergency affecting more than one borough did not operate effectively, partly because they were not designed to provide central direction to the response, and partly because the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea did not seek assistance promptly. In the event, the government, in the form of a senior official in the Department for Communities and Local Government, brokered an arrangement under which the experienced town clerk of the City of London took control of the operation. An important chapter of this part records the evidence given by those who were personally affected by the fire. We are acutely aware that giving evidence, particularly giving evidence in public, was a difficult and daunting experience. We should therefore like to thank all of those who contributed to our investigations by giving evidence, both in the form of witness statements and by being willing to speak about their experiences in public. By doing so, they ensured that we received the fullest possible account of the events that unfolded in the days following the fire. In parts 11, 12 and 13 of the report, we deal with a number of different matters, including the experiments carried out by Professor Bisbee and Professor Torero on the materials used in the refurbishment. They confirmed that the Renabond aluminium composite material panels were the primary reason for the fire's devastating progress. Part 14 contains our recommendations. Although some steps have already been taken to respond to the many failures that we have identified, we think that more can and should be done to bring about a fundamental change in the attitudes and practices of the construction industry. Only such a change can ensure that in future buildings in general and higher risk buildings in particular are safe for those who live and work in them. We think that in different ways implementation of our recommendations will improve fire safety, particularly in high-rise buildings, and ensure that dangerous materials cannot be used in construction in the future. They will also improve the efficiency of fire and rescue services nationally. Our recommendations include, but are not limited to, the following: the appointment of a construction regulator to oversee all aspects of the construction industry, bringing responsibility for all aspects of fire safety under one government department, the establishment of a body of professional fire engineers properly regulated and with protected status, and the introduction of mandatory fire safety strategies for higher risk buildings, a licensing scheme for contractors wishing to undertake the construction or refurbishment of higher risk buildings, the regulation and mandatory accreditation of fire risk assessors, the establishment of a College of Fire and Rescue to provide practical, educational and managerial training to fire and rescue services, and the introduction of a requirement for the government to maintain a publicly accessible record of recommendations made by select committees, coroners and public inquiries, describing the steps taken in response to them or its reasons for declining to implement them. I now return to part 9 of the report, which is the most personal part and contains the most difficult reading. It contains a detailed account of the circumstances surrounding the deaths of those who perished in the fire. I did not refer to it earlier because it seemed to me fitting to end these proceedings as they began in May 2018 with a reminder that the fire at Grenfell Tower was above all a human tragedy in which many lives were lost, families were torn asunder, homes were destroyed, and a community was shattered. The detailed reconstruction we have provided will be for many one of the most important parts of our report. Although it may make painful reading, those who lost relatives and friends naturally feel a need to know as much as possible about their loved ones' last moments. I said on many occasions that I hoped we could find sufficient facts to satisfy the coroner of the circumstances surrounding their deaths and avoid the need for any further proceedings. I'm now able to say that we've been able to make detailed findings about the circumstances in which people died, including calls made to the emergency services, the transfer of information from the control room to the incident ground, the recording of that information on its way to and at the bridgehead, and the steps taken to rescue those who were trapped. We are satisfied that all those who died in the building were overcome by toxic gases produced by the fire, and with expert assistance, we've been able to establish a reasonably accurate time of death in each case. We're satisfied that all those whose bodies were damaged by the fire were already dead by the time it reached them. In a moment, my fellow panel members, Ms. Istefan and Mr. Akbor, wish to add some comments of their own. Before they do so, however, I should like to thank the inquiry team, without whom it would not have been possible to carry out an investigation of this kind. It would be invidious to single out individual names for mention on this occasion, because everyone involved, whatever their particular task, has played an essential part in enabling us to do our work. With their help, we have followed up many lines of inquiry, some of which led to surprising revelations, and have collected and digested a huge number of documents and statements, not to mention hearing many days of oral evidence. All those who worked for the inquiry over the years are named in an appendix to the report, and we owe them a deep debt of gratitude. I now invite Mr. Istefan to say a few words.
Thank you, Sir Martin. Good morning. Before I joined the inquiry panel, I spent nearly 30 years as an architect. In that role, I developed a particular interest in health and safety, fire, and accessibility matters. Returning home from a holiday in June 2017, I flew over West London and saw the burning tower in the early hours from the air. As for so many others, this was a profound shock. First, of course, as a human response, but also as a professional who had spent their career working to make buildings safe. Throughout this inquiry, we have been determined to find out how such a disaster was possible and what needs to be done to save lives in the future. As Sir Martin has just summarised, we have found many failings across a wide range of institutions, organisations and individuals that spanned many years, which together have led to the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower. They include many failures of the construction industry, my own sector, which is where I will focus my comments on today. Since the fire, the government has passed the Building Safety Act. The Act is welcome, but we need to go further. Our report identifies what we think is needed to make sure the legacy of Grenfell is real and brings about lasting and progressive change. Our recommendations place new burdens and responsibilities on people and organisations. I make no apologies for that. Put simply, if you work in the construction industry and you do not feel the weight of responsibility you have for keeping people safe, you are in the wrong job. The change we need to bring about is partly about structures and regulations. Sir Martin has set out the key points in what we have proposed, and the report explains our recommendations in detail. But the necessary change is also one of culture and behaviours. Change on this scale needs to be owned and led by those of us working in the sector. It is not enough to pass an Act of Parliament and to sit back and think the work is done. Without change in behaviour and a recognition that the needs of the people who use our buildings must be placed at the centre of our work, the lessons of Grenfell will not truly be learnt in full. One of the core themes of our report is technical incompetence of many of those involved in the refurbishment project. As hundreds of other buildings are now known to have similar cladding systems, it is clear that the problem of incompetence is widespread. It follows that part of the change that is needed to the culture of the industry is an ongoing commitment to the development of professional skills. If we are not professionally curious, we will not become technically competent. Again, this change needs everyone in the construction industry to play their part in the implementation of the inquiry's recommendations. We must also keep at the very forefront of our minds our responsibilities towards those who are most vulnerable. At Grenfell, a significant number of those who died were children, had disabilities, or were vulnerable in other ways. The risks posed by a particular building and the right response to those risks are always as diverse as the people who live or work in it. That is why we recommend that the government thinks again about defining higher risk buildings solely by reference to their height. It is why the fire safety strategies must be provided for safety of all occupants. And it is why a stay-put strategy will never be appropriate where there is a risk of fire spreading over the building's external walls. It is why we recommend that the government guidance should be reviewed so that the safety and resilience of a building is prioritised. And it is why we stand by the inquiry's Phase 1 recommendation that the need for PEEPs, personal emergency evacuation plans, for residents with mobility issues or other impairments. As an inquiry panel, we have acted throughout with fairness, independence and impartiality. That is what the law requires. At the same time, the losses so many people have suffered and my involvement in this process has left a mark on me as a person and as a professional which will last far beyond this inquiry. And although this inquiry is now ending, we know that for many people their journey continues. We wish them strength for the future. I will now hand over to my colleague Ali.
Thank you, Thoraya. Good morning, everyone. My role as a panel member has been to listen to the evidence, to consider what I have heard, and work with Sir Martin and Thoraya to agree findings and recommendations. Firstly, I would like to express my own heartfelt sympathy to all those whose lives have been affected by this tragic fire. We know that an inquiry can feel like a very slow process. But what I can say is that we have been painstakingly thorough and that we present our report to you with confidence in its veracity. Secondly, I would like to say that I grew up in council housing. I was involved in creating social housing organisations. I was chief executive of a housing association for over 20 years. What I can say is that working on the inquiry has had a profound impact on me personally and as a social housing professional. In social housing, we often say that we put our tenants at the heart of what we do, but it is not enough just to pay lip service to that ideal. In our report, we look at the relationship between Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation and its residents before the fire. We find that it was one of distrust, dislike, personal antagonism, and anger. Residents deserve to be treated with understanding and respect. The TMO failed to do that. We saw a similar failure to treat residents as people and as individuals in the aftermath of the fire, including in the way that those with religious, cultural, or social needs suffered discrimination as a result of RBKC's failure to prepare properly for emergencies. It was obvious to me from watching and listening to evidence being given at the hearing that there were two different groups of people, those who lived at Grenfell and those who worked for the TMO, RBKC, and their agents. In our report, we set out how the government's focus on deregulation dominated the department's thinking, such that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. The deregulation agenda had a parallel impact on social housing, on the social housing sector, particularly in terms of consumer standards and protection for tenants. The effects of that can be seen in the many failings of the TMO, which we set out in our report, and which were not prevented or addressed by the regulatory system then in place. Parliament has now passed the Social Housing Regulation Act, which will enhance the powers of the regulator in support of stronger consumer standards and which stresses the need for involvement and empowerment of tenants, and the reintroduction of inspection of landlords. In my view, this was not a moment too soon. Our report underlines why its full implementation is so important and so urgent. I have focused so far on the TMO's role as a social housing provider. The TMO played an important part in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower in its role as the project's client. We have found that the TMO paid insufficient care in its choice of architect and failed to pay enough attention to fire safety. I hope that our report acts as a reminder to the clients of future building projects, including social housing providers, that they have a responsibility to the users of their buildings to ensure that safety is not sacrificed to the demands of speed and cost. Regulation should not be treated as boxes to be ticked, but as a way of giving residents confidence that their homes are safe. Finally, I would like to echo something that Thoraya has said. We cannot, in a few words here today, do full justice to the totality of our report. What is needed is for those with responsibility for building safety, in my sector as in Thoraya's, to read the report, to reflect on it, and to treat Grenfell as a touchstone in all that they do in the future. And that is to act with professionalism, with competence, and to put people first. I will now pass you back to Sir Martin.
Thank you very much. We should all remember that the Grenfell Tower fire was and remains an intensely personal tragedy for all those who lived in and around the tower, and above all, for those who died, their families and friends. We invite you, therefore, to join us in remembering them while I read out their names. Fathia Ahmed El Sanusi, Abu Fras Mohammed Ibrahim, Isra Ibrahim, Mohammed Hamid Sabah Neda, Hesham Rahman, Rania Ibrahim, Fethia Hassan, Hania Hassan, Marco Gottardi, Gloria Trevisan, Raymond Herbert Moses Bernard, Esla El Gouachri, Mariam El Gouachri, Anthony Keith Disson, Bassem Shuker, Nadia Shuker, Mirna Shuker, Fatima Shuker, Zainab Shuker, Syria Shuker, Hashim Kadir, Nura Jamal, Yahya Hashim, Firdoz Hashim, Yaqub Hashim, Abdulaziz El-Wahhabi, Fazia El-Wahhabi, Yassin El-Wahhabi, Nur Huda El-Wahhabi, Mehdi El-Wahhabi, Ligaya Moore, Jessica Urbano Ramirez, Omar Belkadi, Farah Hamdan, Malak Belkadi, Lena Belkadi, Mary Mendy, Khadija Say, Victoria King, Alexandra Atala, Mohammed Nur Tuku, Amal Ahmadine, Amaya Tuku Ahmadine, Amna Mahmoud Idris, Majri Vital, Ernie Vital, Debbie Lamprell, Gary Maunders, Bechti Haftom, Baruch Haftom, Hamid Khani, Isaac Palos, Sakina Afrasahabi, Fatime Afrasiabi, Vincent Chijina, Khadija Kalufi, Kamru Mia, Rabea Begum, Mohammed Hamid, Mohammed Hanif, Husna Begum, Joseph Daniels, Sheila, Steve Power, Zainab Dean, Jeremiah Dean, Mohammed Al-Hajali, Dennis Murphy, Ali Yahwa Jafari, Abdeslam Sabah, Logan Gomez, Billy Burton. Thank you all very much.